He met my eyes, his voice steady and kind. Joanne, sometimes we forget that being seen starts with seeing ourselves. I'm Joanne, 60 years old, and that one sentence from my husband's boss shattered everything I thought was safe, everything I thought was true. What would you do if someone unexpected saw the loneliness you had hidden even from yourself? Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever faced a truth so raw you couldn't unhear it? I never thought that at the age of 60, I would find myself standing at the threshold of an emotional storm. My name is Joanne. My life, until that night, had flowed as gently as a windless day. Every morning, I tended to the small garden behind our house, where yellow daisies and lavender swayed in the rhythm of sunlight. In the afternoons, I read in an old armchair, listening to the steady ticking of the wooden clock. At night, I sat beside Stephen, my husband, the man I had been with for nearly 40 years. We would have dinner together, watch TV, and go to bed wrapped in the routines carefully stitched by stability. Everything seemed so solid until that gala night. Stephen AQ, as he did every year, invited me to attend the biggest company event of the year, a formal evening at a grand hotel in downtown Chicago, where crystal chandeliers shone down on tailored tuxedos and elegant evening gowns. I wore a simple navy blue dress, applied a touch of makeup, telling myself that all I needed to do was play the role of the supportive wife. Like always, Stephen quickly disappeared into conversations with his colleagues, his eyes lighting up as he talked about contracts, projects, and major deals. Meanwhile, I, as usual, found a small corner among the other wives, exchanging polite, empty conversations. And then Edward approached, Edward Caldwell, Stephen's boss, a man with a composed demeanor, sharp eyes, and gracefully silvered hair. I didn't know him well, aside from the occasional polite handshakes over the years. Joanne, could I borrow a moment of your time? Edward asked, his deep voice cutting through the clamor of the party. I was slightly surprised. Why would he want to speak with me privately? But courtesy made me smile and nod. I followed him through a narrow hallway, the soft yellow lights and thick carpet swallowing the sound of our steps. We stopped before a small lounge where a fireplace crackled quietly and the scent of worn leather chairs lingered in the air. I sat across from Edward, curiosity stirring in my chest. I hope I'm not intruding, Edward began, his hands clasped thoughtfully together. It's fine, I replied, my voice light as a breeze, though inside I could feel my heart beating faster than usual. The thing is, Edward hesitated as if weighing each word carefully. What is it? I asked, anxiety prickling. He took a deep breath and looked straight into my eyes. It's about Stephen. At that moment, the air seemed to thicken around us. I straightened in my seat, sensing something unsettling on the horizon. Is there something wrong? I whispered. Edward shook his head. Not exactly. Stephen is a good man, a model employee, but he leaned forward, his gaze suddenly so sharp it rooted me to my seat. Have you ever felt unseen? I froze. Miss Joanne? Edward continued, his voice low but warm. Stephen is very busy. I see the way he throws himself into his work and the way his eyes skim over you, as if you're just part of the backdrop of his life instead of its center. I opened my mouth to protest, but no words came out. Part of me wanted to deny it, to defend Stephen, but another part, deep down and aching, knew that Edward had touched a fracture I had been pretending not to see for years. I'm sorry if I'm being too forward, Edward said, his voice softening, but sometimes outsiders can see things more clearly. I clenched my hands in my lap, feeling as if the mirror of my life had just been turned toward me, and the reflection staring back sent a chill through my bones. Edward said, polite and reserved, you don't have to say anything. I just hope you won't forget yourself. I sat there, watching him disappear down the dim hallway. Inside me, a strange seed had been planted, small, but impossible to ignore. Returning to the banquet hall, I felt as if I had stepped into a different world, a world I no longer belonged to. Stephen was still there, standing among his colleagues, his voice animated as he discussed contracts and future projects. He didn't notice that I had been gone from the party for over half an hour. Even the glance he gave me was nothing more than a passing nod, as if I were merely a shadow drifting by. I stood still, in my simple navy dress, amidst the crowd glittering under the crystal lights. And for the first time in many years, I asked myself, when did I become invisible? I took a sip of wine, the bitter taste flooding my mouth, as uncomfortable as the emotions rising in my chest. Edward's words still echoed in my ears. Have you ever felt unseen? I thought of the evenings when Stephen buried himself in his laptop, of birthdays marked only by a rushed bouquet, of dinners drowned in silence. I thought of how he once looked at me when we were young, when had that loving gaze disappeared. I felt a tiny fracture inside myself, a crack that no amount of resignation could mend. On the drive home, the car sped along the dark highway. Stephen gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed ahead. Inside the car, aside from the steady hum of the engine, there was a dense, heavier silence than ever before. How was the party? Stephen asked, his voice flat, like reciting a rehearsed line. Quite interesting, I replied, forcing a smile, but inside, I no longer felt fully present in this life. Stephen nodded and returned to silence. He didn't notice the way my hands clutched at my dress or how my gaze kept drifting toward the window as if wanting to escape. A question kept swirling in my mind, sharp as a freezing wind. Do I even exist in Stephen's world anymore? When we got home, everything unfolded as it always did. Stephen hung up his coat, placed his keys on a table, and disappeared into his office, the room he spent more time in than the living room or our bedroom. I stood in the kitchen, my fingers tracing the cold edge of the counter. The house was so quiet, I could hear my own heart pounding in my chest. I lifted my head and caught my reflection in the glass door. A woman with graying hair, carrying a quiet sadness in her eyes that even I found unfamiliar. And for the first time in a long while, I whispered to myself, Joanne, how much longer will you keep losing yourself? That night, I tossed and turned on the familiar bed. Stephen lay beside me, his steady breathing a cruel reminder that everything was fine for him. Only for me was everything falling apart. I thought of Edward, of the way he looked at me, not with pity, but with recognition. And I knew the smoldering fire inside me had been reignited. It wouldn't be easily extinguished. Tomorrow morning, I would do something I had long delayed. I would seek an honest conversation about what I truly needed. That morning, the air was chilly and the trees along the road drooped mournfully under the gray clouds. I sat alone in the kitchen, a cold cup of tea in my hand, my heart tangled with emotions so heavy I could barely breathe. Stephen had left early, as usual, leaving behind a large, empty house where the ticking of the clock was the only reminder that I was still alive, but how I was living, even I wasn't sure anymore. I picked up my phone, hesitating. Edward's number was still there, saved from the gala night, something I had never thought I would actually use. I didn't know what I was hoping for. Advice, a bit of understanding, or maybe just someone who would truly listen to me. Just once. Truly? Before I could hesitate any longer, I pressed call. The phone barely rang 3 times before Edward answered, his deep, warm voice coming through. Joanne? Just one word, yet it felt like a warm embrace in the middle of a cold gust of wind. I took a deep breath, gathering all my courage. Edward, would you have time for a cup of coffee? There was a brief pause, then, I'm near Lakeview. There's a little cafe by the lake, very quiet. I'll send you the address. Half an hour later, I stepped into a small cafe called Whispering Leaves, where the warm yellow lights and soft jazz music seemed to melt away a bit of the loneliness inside me. Edward was already there, sitting at a table in the corner, his figure solid and calm, like an old tree standing steady amidst a stormy forest. As I approached, he stood up, smiling in welcome. Not overly eager, not making me feel awkward, just simply seeing me. Hello, Joanne, he said, his voice so gentle it felt like he was afraid of breaking the fragile emotion surrounding us. I sat down across from him, my hands unconsciously clutching the scarf around my neck. We ordered 2 cups of coffee black for me, espresso for him, and in that silent moment, I realized how accustomed I had become to not being asked about, not being cared for. Strangely, the sensation of having someone's full attention made my heart tremble like a little girl once again. I've been thinking a lot about what you said that night, I began, my voice hoarse. Edward didn't rush to interrupt. He just nodded slightly, as if he already knew I needed time to find my own words. I don't hate my life, I continued, my eyes drifting toward the window where autumn leaves swirled in the wind. Stephen is a good husband, a decent man, but somewhere along the way, I lost myself without even realizing it. Edward took a sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving me. Joanne, you don't have to apologize for your feelings, he said softly. Not everyone is brave enough to face that emptiness. I gave a bitter smile. There are days I look into the mirror and don't recognize myself, not because of age, but because I've disappeared little by little inside my own life. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering the last leaves of the season, mirroring the chaos inside me. Edward stayed silent, but the way he listened fully, sincerely, made me feel like I had just laid down a burden I had carried for far too long. We sat there for a long time, no need for many words, just two people each carrying their own cracks, finding quiet understanding amidst a noisy world. But before we left, Edward said gently, Joanne, sometimes it's not because we stopped mattering to someone else. It's because we forgot we deserved to matter to ourselves. I tightened my scarf around me, feeling as if he had just lit a small flame inside a heart that had been cold for far too long. As I stepped outside, the wind blew harder and a light rain began to fall. But I didn't rush to find shelter like before. I kept walking, letting the cold raindrops hit my face, reminding me that I could still feel, that I was still alive. That evening, when Stephen returned from the office, the sky was already dark and the rain was drumming steadily on the roof. I stood in the kitchen, holding a cold cup of tea, staring at the front door, as if it were the boundary between two worlds I was about to cross. Stephen walked in, his familiar, tired figure. His coat was damp from the rain, and his breath carried the faint scent of peppermint from the candies he usually had while driving. Hi, he said, barely glancing at me as he set his briefcase down on the table. Have you had dinner? I asked, trying to keep my voice even. Not very hungry, he replied briefly, then hurried off into his study as he always did. I watched his figure disappear down the hall, a deep, aching sadness welling up inside me. How long had it been since we only exchanged pleasantries like strangers? I placed the teacup on the table, wiped my hands on my apron, and made a decision. I could not stay silent anymore. I knocked in lightly on the door of the study. Stephen, can we talk for a minute? He looked up from his laptop, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. What is it, honey? I stepped in, closing the door behind me. In that moment, the room seemed to shrink, filled only with the ticking of the clock and the steady tapping of the rain against the window. I sat down across from him, my hands clasped tightly together. Stephen, I began, my voice trembling slightly. Have you ever felt like we're living next to each other but actually separated by an entire ocean? He frowned, took off his glasses, and looked at me as if I had said something strange. Joanne, I don't understand. You're okay, right? We have a stable, peaceful life. I gave a sad smile. Stable, peaceful, but Stephen, what about love? What about truly seeing each other? Stephen was silent. His eyes wavered, as if searching for an answer somewhere far away that he had long forgotten how to reach. I continued, each word pulled from deep within my chest. Do you even remember the last time you looked at me? Not as part of this house, but as a person? With dreams, with feelings? Stephen slumped into his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. I've been so busy, Joanne. Work, planning for the future. I understand, I cut in, gentle but firm. I've never blamed you for that. But I let myself disappear into that stability for too long. The air between us thickened, as if every word I spoke etched deeper into the invisible gap we had unknowingly carved over the years. Stephen stayed silent. No excuses, no anger, and that was the most heartbreaking part. He didn't fight to hold on to me. He just sat there, motionless, as if he himself was no longer sure when we had lost each other. I stood up, feeling both heavy and strangely lighter inside. I'll sleep in the living room tonight, I said. I need time to think. Stephen said nothing, only nodded. I walked out of the room, the door closing softly behind me like a silent farewell left unspoken. That night, curled up on the old sofa, listening to the steady rain outside the porch, I realized the silence between us was colder than any storm, and once again, Edward's words echoed in my mind. Joanne, you deserve to be seen. The next morning, the cold autumn sunlight streamed through the window, casting its pale glow over the silent spaces of the house I once called home. I woke up on the sofa, my body aching, but my mind unusually clear. Stephen had left early for work, leaving the house in absolute stillness. I sat up, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and stood quietly by the window, watching the yellow leaves drift in the wind. Inside me, a gnawing question echoed. If I did nothing, would this life just keep drifting by until the end of my days? The phone on the table buzzed softly. The caller ID lit up. Edward. My heart pounded against my chest. I hesitated for a second, then picked up. Joanne, Edward's deep, warm voice said. I'm sorry if I'm disturbing you. I don't even know why I feel relieved hearing your voice, I whispered, more honest with myself than I had been in years. There was a brief silence on the other end. Then Edward asked, would you like to meet me? Not to talk about Stephen, not to run away from anything, just simply to think for yourself. I tightened my grip on the coffee cup. A part of me screamed, don't go, don't rush to destroy what's safe. But another part, small yet fierce, whispered, give yourself a chance to feel life. We agreed to meet at a small cafe near Lake Michigan, a quiet, modest place filled with sunlight and the scent of freshly baked pastries. I walked in, my palms damp with sweat. Edward was already there, wearing a simple wool coat, his eyes patient, not urging. When I sat down, he simply smiled, a smile that offered nothing but presence. We talked about the years that had passed, about forgotten dreams, about the small moments swept away by the busyness of life. No one mentioned Stephen. No one mentioned the fragile lines of morality. There were only two people, each longing to be understood, to be seen, to find their way again. I don't know what I'm doing, I confessed, eyes lowered to my now cold tea. That's perfectly fine, Edward said gently. Sometimes the most important steps in life begin with uncertainty. I looked up, meeting his eyes, and saw there not seduction, not empty promises, but deep understanding, a rare patience. When I returned home in the late afternoon, I stood for a long time before the unopened door. Inside, I knew that whether I chose to move forward or to turn back, I would never again be the same woman, the one who silently endured, who accepted fading away. Once again, Edward's words echoed in my mind. Joanne, you deserve to be seen. And for the first time in many years, I believed it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the ticking of the clock, each beat a reminder that time kept flowing quietly, indifferent to the turmoil inside me. Stephen came home late, just as he had said. The door opened softly, and his heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. I heard the sounds of him taking off his shoes, hanging up his coat, and pouring a cup of coffee in the kitchen. He didn't know I was awake. He didn't know that tonight everything would be different. I sat up, threw on a thin robe, and stepped out of the bedroom. Stephen looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing his face when he saw me standing there. You're still up? He asked, his voice tired. We need to talk, I said, my voice calmer than I had expected. Stephen frowned, setting his coffee cup down on the kitchen counter. About what? I took a deep breath, forcing myself not to look away. About us. About this marriage. He stayed silent. A heavy, loaded silence. Then he sighed, as if he had been expecting this conversation for a long time, but feared it as much as I did. I know you haven't been happy lately, Stephen began, avoiding my eyes. Work's been busy, I've been tired, but you know, everything I do, it's for the family. I gave a bitter smile, not from anger, but from a sorrow too vast to conceal. Stephen, I said slowly, have you ever wondered what I needed all these years? Not a beautiful house, not expensive trips, but a look, a touch, a simple question. How are you today? He looked at me, as if for the first time in years he was actually hearing me. I thought, Stephen faltered, I thought we were okay. We're still together. Together, I whispered. But we don't see each other anymore, Stephen. We live in the same house, but we're strangers. I clenched my hands, trying to keep my voice from trembling. I don't blame you. I'm at fault too. I let myself fade away to keep us okay, but I can't keep doing this. Stephen took a step closer, his face a mix of regret and fear. Joanne, what are you saying? You want a divorce? I looked him straight in the eye, no longer hiding. I don't know, I said honestly. But I do know that if we want to continue, something has to change. Not just promises, action, presence, seeing each other. Truly. Wrong. Stephen bowed his head, his hands trembling slightly, and I realized, for the first time in years, we weren't hiding behind fake silences anymore. We were facing each other, even if it hurt. When Stephen quietly left the kitchen, I stayed there, my hand pressed against my heart. It hurt, but it beat stronger than it had in a long time. I knew that even though the road ahead was still uncertain, as long as I stayed true to myself, I wouldn't be lost again. I had started living for myself. In the days that followed, the house fell into a strange silence. No more empty small talk between Stephen and me, only awkward glances, heavy pauses stretching through every meal, every step echoing down the cold hallway. Stephen tried, I could see it. He came home earlier. He cooked dinner, clumsily but earnestly. He asked me little questions. Are you tired? How was your day? But some cracks, once they spread, can never be fully mended, no matter how hard you try. One evening, while Stephen slept, I stepped out onto the balcony. Outside, the night had deepened, the wind blowing gently, distant streetlights flickering faintly through the mist. I hugged my robe tightly around me, staring up at the star-strewn sky, and I realized I was lonely. Not because Stephen had abandoned me, but because I had abandoned myself. A long time ago, I had lived for him, for the family, for all the right things, but I had never lived for myself. Tears slipped down quietly. In my mind, Edward's words echoed, Joanne, you deserve to be seen, to be felt, to truly live. I didn't know what would happen with Edward and me in the future. I wasn't sure if I could ever trust the voice inside me again, but I knew it deserved to be heard. Then I knew one thing. I could no longer live a half-life just to please others. The next morning, under the pale winter light, I packed a few personal belongings. Stephen sat at the dining table, dark circles under his eyes. Where are you going? He asked, his voice hoarse. I walked over to him gently. I need to find myself, I said. If there's ever to be a chance for us to begin again, it has to come from each of us truly living first. Stephen said nothing. He just looked at me, his eyes rimmed red. For the first time in many years, he didn't try to hold on with rushed promises. He understood. I kissed him lightly on the forehead, a tender goodbye. Pulling my suitcase quietly over the threshold, I stepped out of the house that had once held all my youth and dreams. No hatred, no blame. Just a 60-year-old woman, for the first time in her life, choosing to walk away over herself. Under the vast sky, I felt afraid, but freer than I had ever been. I rented a small apartment near the lake. Simple, cozy, just enough for myself. In the mornings, I made a cup of coffee, flung open the windows, and let the cold wind rush in, tossing my graying hair. In the afternoons, I strolled along the trail by the lake, watching each leaf slowly fall onto the still surface of the water. No one waited for dinner anymore, no more frantic typing through the night, only the sound of my own heart, beating slowly but resolutely. Some evenings, I sat in a familiar cafe, writing down small things, scraps of memories, dreams that had once been buried. I started meeting old friends again, even making acquaintances with complete strangers. No agenda, no attachments, just to feel I was still alive. Edward's words stayed quietly with me, like a compass pointing inward. Occasionally, he sent a simple message, "Hope you smiled today." I didn't reply, not out of coldness, but because I knew this journey was mine alone. I needed to learn how to walk on my own before I could open my heart again. Stephen sent me a handwritten letter after 3 months. Brief, sincere. He apologized, not for any specific wrongdoing, but for having forgotten to see me as a person, not just as part of the comfortable life he had built. I folded the letter and tucked it away in a drawer. Forgiveness wasn't for him, it was for myself. Bazoo, when you live too long within someone else's habits, you forget the sound of your own voice. But once you hear it again, you never want to return to that old silence. I am 60 years old, no longer youthful, but for the first time in decades, I feel like I am holding an open future in my hands. A future where I am not just surviving, but truly seen, felt, and loved, starting with myself. When Joanne stood at the crossroads of her life, between the safety of routine and the yearning to live authentically, did you see a reflection of yourself in that image? There are moments when just a brief conversation can overturn everything we once believed. Leave a comment. Do you think Joanne was right to choose to face herself? If you were her, how would you move forward? Do you believe that at any age we have the right to see ourselves again? Don't hesitate to share your story or your thoughts. Sometimes it's the most honest emotions that find a common voice in the hearts of others.